Welcome everyone. Today we have Leah Frermann, but before we get into that, let me first acknowledge the traditional owners upon which land this seminar is taking place, the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people, and I pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and future. Leah is a well-known figure for many people here in the room. But for those of you who don't know her, Leah is a lecturer in the School of Computing and Information Systems in the field of natural language processing. She studies automatic understanding of long and complex texts, books, movie scripts with help of access to common sense knowledge. And before she came to Melbourne, Leah obtained a PhD at the University of Edinburgh. She was a postdoc at both Edinburgh and Amazon Research in Berlin and spent research visits to a variety of institutions, including Stanford University and Columbia University. Her research focuses on understanding how humans learn about and represent complex and evolving information in the context of large-scale and noisy environments, and on using these insights to develop fairer and more robust automatic systems. She combines methods from natural language processing, machine learning, and computational cognitive modeling. And today's talk is titled, Conflicts, Villains, Resolutions Towards Models of Narrative Media. That's a long title. So I won't go into the specifics of the talk, but I'm really looking forward to hear much more about this. And I give the floor to Leah. Thanks for coming, Leah.
I think so. Yep. Thanks very much for inviting me. It's great to be here and speak to all of you. So before I go into the content of this talk, I thought I'd give a little overview about what I'm interested in and what I like to do research on, as maybe there are other synergies or things that people want to contact me about. And on all of this, I'm very happy to have conversations with all of you, get feedback, and also throughout the talk, feel free to jump in with questions, or if things are confusing, just interrupt me and ask. So my research kind of falls into three buckets. The one bucket is combining natural language processing and computational cognitive modeling in order to better understand how humans learn about and use language, and also categorical knowledge on how we use and represent common sense knowledge. I work with Simon, for instance, using the small world of words data set in an NLP context. The second block is on bias and fairness or unfairness in NLP. So with NLP methods becoming more and more important in all sorts of application domains, it's important that we understand whether they are biased and where the biases are in these models, and how we can improve the models in terms of making them less biased. I firmly believe that machine learning and NLP people will not solve bias in the world. So I think it's very important to do this interdisciplinarily and work with people who actually understand people. So social scientists, sociologists, and so forth. So this is another angle that I'm interested in, and cognitive scientists and psychologists would fall into that category very much as well. And then the third bucket is what I will talk about more in this talk. And this is about understanding narratives or long text. So I have worked on novels and movie scripts, summarization, for instance, of these very, very long and complex texts. And most recently, I'm interested in combining this with media reporting. So how does media reporting, media bias, media framing intersect with narratives or storytelling? And that's what the rest of this talk will be about. And before we get into the nitty-gritty details, let's just think about what a narrative is, or a story is. So it's quite a complex thing, really, if you think about it. It consists of characters, lots of different ones, which are in different relations with one another. They go through a series of events, which might change the relationships, change the characters themselves. There's almost always this kind of arc of suspense, or story arc, where we start out with a story, then the suspense increases, there's a struggle, a conflict, which ends up in a crisis or a climax, and then in the very end, the conflict is either resolved, in which case we have a happy ending, or maybe not resolved, in which case we have a drama. So there's a lot going on. It's very easy for us to understand all this, but for machines, it's very hard, because there's so much common sense knowledge underlying here that we just have access to. That's pretty hard to get into machines or get out of machines. So stories or narratives are universal to humans and human societies. For well, tens of thousands of years, it can be shown that societies have used storytelling to transmit knowledge, to contextualize facts. We use it every day to kind of make sense of the things we experience in the world, to contextualize individual events into a coherent overall narrative. And this comes very naturally to us, as I said, but heavily relies on underlying knowledge, on common sense knowledge, on what it means to be happy or to be sad or be in a romantic relationship and so forth. Which means that it makes it very challenging for automatic methods to understand this or to generate coherent, long narratives without jumping back and forth. Well, all of this has been put into question a little bit by the very recent NLP developments like ChatGPT, and in the very end, we can come back to this, where it seems that these methods, to some extent, solve the issues that we NLP people have been working on for decades and decades. So there's definitely been a huge leap in a lot of these problems, but I do not think at all that it's been solved with the latest innovations. So this was the introduction on narratives. Now, what about framing? What is framing? It's a fuzzy concept, and we will try to pin it down a little bit in a minute. But here's a very simple example of framing, namely presenting the same fact from different angles in order to elicit a certain response in the listener or a certain reaction. So you could say that a new show was a flop because nearly half of the viewers hated it. Or you could say that a new TV show was a huge hit with almost 6 out of 10 viewers being very excited about it, right? You frame the same piece of information, the same fact, in two very different ways. So the semantics underlying these is the same. It's just the context in which you present it that changes. And this happens all the time. So the domain of this talk will be news reporting, and especially with complex, debated issues like climate change, for instance, we see the framing from different parties, different news outlets, and so forth. Often this is agenda driven because they cater towards a certain group of society and so forth. But we basically, there's no such thing as completely neutral news reporting. So there's almost always a spin to the story, even just because news reports are constrained in their length, right? So you need to press a lot of content into a fairly short text. So you have to omit certain facts and you have to present facts in a certain way. So here's one definition of framing. So frames are persistent patterns of cognition, interpretation, or presentation by which symbol handlers, journalists, for instance, routinely organize discourse. And this is sort of what this talk is about. It's about the persistent patterns. And we can use natural language processing to identify these at scale, at a much larger scale than has been done before. So research on framing is decades old, and there's a lot of background literature in the communication science and political science. But here we try to use NLP to scale it all up, but scale it all up in a kind of theoretically grounded way. So the set of frames that I'll be using is one of the most widely used set of frames in the communication literature. It's been verified again and again and again. And the second thing that this talk will be about is about the organization of discourse. So the set of frames that I will use, as you will see, is well suited to model certain aspects of narratives or of discourse within a single news article. And I'll go about into much more detail about that. So this talk is about the frame building side of framing. How do frames emerge in news reports or in written pieces of media reports? There's a different angle to framing as well, which is all about how they have an effect on individuals' understanding, behavior, attitudes. And this is not what this talk is about. This is called frame setting. So if we know there's certain framing, we can ask what effect does this have on the actual readership? However, I think that there is research in this area within the hub, within psychology. I've never gotten to actually talking to people about this, but one future direction of work that I'm very interested in is taking this next step and using the automatic analyses that I will talk about here to ask what effect they have on the readers in the downstream kind of scenario. Okay, so again, framing here will be all in the context of news articles on a certain controversial issue or highly debated issue. In this particular talk, it will be all about climate change, but framing has been analyzed and detected plays an important role in the discourse on many, many different topics that are under high debate in the media. So then the final question of the introduction is, how do we connect narratives and framing, right? I talked about these two separately now. And if we go back to what makes a narrative, I will present a set of frames that kind of directly refer to essential components of a narrative. Most importantly, the conflict component, which is inherent in a narrative, and the resolution component. And we can ask to what extent are conflicts being discussed, resolutions being discussed, also the impact of these conflicts and problems on individuals being discussed. And there's a second connection that I will talk about, and that's with regard to the entities or the characters. So how are important entities framed that play a role within climate change? What narrative role is being given to them? Are they being framed as the bad guys or the good guys or the victims of certain policies and so forth? Okay, and what I will talk about is a paper that was recently accepted to ACL, and that will flesh it all out in a lot more technical detail. And to set it somewhat apart from what has happened previously in natural language processing, so NLP got quite excited about framing for the last 7-8 years, perhaps. There's been quite a bit of work. However, the things that I would criticize here overall is that the approach is a little bit oversimplified when you compare it to the fairly complex theories and discussions that go on in the communication literature. And there's just limited awareness to this. So very often we like to press this problem into a kind of technical setup that we know very well, which is classification. So we framing a single label classification, where we take a piece of text and label it with a single frame. So this news article is framed from a moral perspective, let's say, or framed from a security perspective, which seems oversimplified since a lot can go on in one news article. For that reason, often people also look at very short text, sometimes only at headlines or at tweets. And the frames that have been considered look suspiciously like topics. So I will take a slightly more high-level notion of framing here, which connects better to this narrative idea that I talked about. And the rest of the talk will be in 4 parts. I will first present the formalization of narrative framing. So what are the frames that we actually look at? Talk about an annotation exercise and a data set where we collected some labeled data on this, which we can then use to analyze the dominant narratives in the media on climate change across the political spectrum. And then I'll also talk about a predictive model, which we can use to automatically predict our frames in order to scale up analyses in the end. So what is our frame set, which, as I said, will kind of link into this idea of a narrative? We will use a set of 5 frames, which have been widely used in the communicative sciences. The first frame is about resolution. So is there discussion in the article on how the issue under discussion, which is climate change for us, could be alleviated or resolved? Are there actors who could have a positive impact? The second one is about conflict. So are multiple perspectives being described? Are there disagreements between groups or institutions discussed in the article, and so forth? Is there discussion on human interest, which is about the dramatization, emotionalization? Is there discussion of how the issue impacts individuals' personal lives? Is there discussion of economic consequences? And finally, is there a moral angle on the issue? So religious references fall under this as well, things being framed as good or bad, and so forth. So these are the 5 fundamental frames which have been attested with respect to many, many different topics. And here we use them in the context of climate change. And you can already see resolution, conflict, human interests, these tie directly into the narratives. The second thing we do is tease out narrative roles of entities, as I said before. So how do we do this? So we have our 5 frames here, and we can see that some of them directly hint at certain roles of entities that are inside the frame. So the resolution frame talks about or asks about actors who could exert positive impact, who could solve the issue. So these are kind of presented in a positive light, and I label them very stereotypically heroes here as just one of the most common narrative roles that we see in all sorts of narratives. Then in conflict is fundamentally about disagreements between parties. So it could be between villains or people responsible, groups responsible for the issue versus groups suffering under the issue, or groups responsible for the issue versus groups trying to resolve the issue. And then the human interest frame is fundamentally about affected individuals, so those who suffer under the issue or are victims in the issue. And what we will do is tease out specific entities which fall into these roles explicitly during our annotation task. And I should say that while these frames have been used before, this explicit tying together with narrative roles is something we do for the first time. However, this is based on other prior work in narrative framing, the narrative policy framework, which I cite in the title, which you can't see here, unfortunately, but they showed that this framing of entities into heroes, villains, and victims is very prevalent in the context of policy discussion specifically. So the ideas are not new, and I tried and tested. Just this linking here is something that we introduced in the general framework. So just a word on what do we consider as a valid entity or a character in a news report. So we take a very broad definition of characters, and we consider any individual, group, thing, or concept that affects or is affected by climate change. So these don't need to be animate or human. We consider, for instance, the industry as an actor, companies, emissions, politicians, the natural environment, and so forth. And then finally, what we will do is group this huge set of different entities that we will discover in news reports into more general categories that we call stakeholder categories. And we defined 11 of them based on the prior literature, and these are the general kind of stakeholders that are discussed in the context of climate change. And I will get back to that later on when we do the analysis. Okay, this concludes the formalization, the general framework that we will work with. And next I will talk about how we collected annotated data in order to label a decent set of news articles with these frames, which is not at all trivial, as you can possibly imagine. We started out from an enormous corpus of news data sets, which is released every year. It's called the NELA data set. It's all English news, predominantly from the US. And we looked at the 2017, 2018, and 2019 corpus. All of these news articles can be annotated with respect to the political leaning of the outlet that produced an article. So from the very left to the very right, which means that we can then do analyses across the political spectrum. And we extracted news articles relevant to climate change by just a simple keyword matching technique. So we used the Wikipedia set of climate change and global warming relevant keywords and then extracted relevant articles by looking at one or more matches of these keywords. And this gave us about 17,000 climate change related news articles across the political spectrum, which is our base data set. And we then annotated a much, much, much smaller subset of this with frames. So in principle, we could then go and ask annotators, does the article mention conflicts? Does the article mention resolution? Does the article comment on effects on individuals? But that's a very hard task, right? It's very hard to pinpoint and will be very subjective for the annotator, so we do not do this. Instead, we, again, based on what's been done in the communication science, define a much larger set of binary questions, which are a lot more specific and less ambiguous, less subjective. And there are 22 of these, which we mostly took from the prior literature. We added one or two due to the climate change specific context that we have here, and then had annotators give answers to every single one of these 22 binary questions with respect to a particular news article. And as I highlight here in blue, some of these questions directly ask about certain entities and their role in the newspaper. in the news article. So does the story suggest that some entity could alleviate the problem, which would suggest that there's some entity which plays a kind of hero-style role in this narrative? If an annotator answered such a question with yes, then we also ask the annotator to extract the entity from the news article, so to copy paste the actual string that indicates the entity, like Donald Trump or the industry or the Pacific Ocean. Here's just a snapshot of the article, of the interface, where you see an article on the left. We kind of pre-highlighted the most important entities to make it a little bit easier for the annotators to spot these entities in the news article. And then there's just a long list of binary questions where the annotator decides on the answer and can also either extract one of the pre-highlighted entities or select their own entity in case there was a different one that really falls into this role, but that we hadn't pre-highlighted. And this was done automatically. It's a little bit noisy, but we don't tie the annotators to this. They can ignore this if they wanted to. In terms of annotators, we hired 4 annotators here in Melbourne who are English native speakers and have some background in this domain. We trained them substantially, so they discussed quite a bit. We went through multiple rounds of refining the annotation guidelines. We annotated ourselves and provided some examples to them and identified ambiguous cases, which we then specifically refined the instructions for and so forth. So it's a traditional annotation refinement process. And in the end, we managed to label 425 articles by at least 2 annotators. So this is our labeled data sets of news articles with frame labels. This is very roughly balanced across the years and pretty well balanced across the political leaning from left to right news outlets. The agreement, even after this training, was poor to moderate or low to moderate. With regards to the binary questions, we got moderate agreement overall. With regards to the entities, so whether a certain entity role is present in a news article, and then also again, if 2 annotators said yes, if they annotated the same, if they extracted the same string entity from the news article, there the agreement was even lower. These are Krippendorf alpha scores here. So while we use the entity annotation in analyses, at least for this work, we only went on to train predictive models for the frames of a news article in the end, arguing that the current agreement is probably too low to get a reliable training signal out of this. So one more nuance is from our framework here, what we get is 22 binary answers for every news article, but what we really want is a labeling with respect to the 5 frames that I showed you earlier on, right? Conflict resolution and so forth. So prior work has suggested that certain groups of these questions group together into a certain frame. And based on the pattern of answers to the individual questions, you can then derive whether a frame is present in an article or not. So we do the same thing. We ran confirmatory factor analysis just to make sure that the grouping of questions to frames in previous work also applies in our climate change context here, which broadly was the case. We threw out a couple of questions which didn't map well, but we retained, I don't remember the exact number now, but most of them mapped just in the way as had been confirmed in prior work. And then whenever an article was labeled with at least 2 questions that pertain to a particular frame by at least 2 of our annotators, then we assert that the frame is present in the news article. And this in the end gives us a multi-labeled data set of our 400+ news articles, where every article is labeled with between 0 and all 5 frames. And I just show you the distribution here. So the vast majority of news articles contain only the conflict frame. To a lesser extent, there are news articles which talk about conflicts and also resolutions. Quite a few don't contain any of our frames at all, and so forth. So these are just the most common labels. There's a tail, of course, of all the different combinations. Okay, this concludes the annotation framework and data collection phase. So now we have our annotated articles, and we can use them to do a bit of an exploratory analysis to see to what extent these frames and different roles correlate, how they occur with different political leanings, and so forth. And here's one such analysis where we look at our 5 different frames and see how prevalent they are in news outlets from a particular leaning. So from the very left over the center to the very right. And one thing you can see is that, so the first thing you can see is, again, that the conflict frame is most prevalent throughout. It's also the case that resolutions, for instance, one other interesting thing to see here is that resolutions seem to be more prevalent in left-ish, left and center-left outlets compared to right and questionable source outlets. The human interest, on the other hand, has a higher peak, and also morality seems to peak more in the right hand and questionable source sites. But none of these was hugely a surprise. The second thing we can ask is, how do the different roles, the heroes, villains, and victims, co-occur with the different frames? So we again have our 5 frames and look within each of the frames and how many articles do we see an entity that takes on one of the different roles. And again, not too surprising, but heroes, they peak in the resolution frame. So the blue bar here is highest. In the conflict frame, we see a peak of villains, and in conflict and also human interest in general, we see more villains and victims than the heroes. And then to dive a little bit deeper and look into a little bit more content, what we can do is look at the different stakeholder categories, where, as I told you earlier, we extracted all our entities, which were thousands across all the 400 news articles. And then we grouped these specific entities like Trump and Obama and the Pacific Ocean and so forth into our 11 stakeholder categories. And here you see a subset of these 11 stakeholder categories along the x-axis. And then within each of these stakeholder categories, we can check to what extent these stakeholders were framed as heroes or villains or victims. And what we can see here is that governments, politicians, and also the industry, they are predominantly framed in a victim role. Legislation and policy are more often than not framed as heroes or as methods that can alleviate or resolve the issue, or at least contribute to resolution of the issue of climate change. The environment and also the general public are predominantly presented as victims, so those who suffer under climate change. And environmental activists, they are kind of split between a hero and a villain role. So, well, in the first instance, they are not very prevalent in the data set at all, but when they are presented, it's kind of half-half, putting them into the role of people who can alleviate the issue or people who are just behind the issue and are making it worse. And so one thing we do not yet, or we do here, is conflate it all across the political leanings. So all the bars here are combining news articles across the political leanings. However, you might imagine that the certain groups are discussed quite differently in articles from the left versus the right. So one thing I would do next is just for the legislation and policies stakeholder category, I will disentangle this across the 4 political leanings that we have in our data set. And it looks like this. So this is legislation and policy, and we look at to what extent legislation is being framed as a hero or a villain or a victim across the 4 different political outlets. And here now it gets interesting because we can see, as we might expect, that the left-leaning media considers policy and legislation a lot more positively compared to the right-leaning media. Whereas at the right, policy and legislation really is predominantly framed in the villain role. Yeah. Which concludes the exploratory analysis. Is there any questions or confusions? Feel free to interrupt.
Questionable source, maybe.
Yeah, so all these. Okay, the question was what questionable source means. We got these labels from a website called Media Bias Fact Check. So we used their categorization of news articles in these different buckets. And questionable sources are conspiracy theory promoting outlets, which are not really considered as a dependable news outlet and yeah, a well-regarded news outlet. Okay.
One more question about one of the previous results. You had a bunch of articles that weren't tagged with any frame. Can you say a bit about what they were?
All right. I haven't looked into that to a large degree. So we had a pre-screening question where the annotator had to confirm that the main topic of the article is indeed climate change. So it is not the case that they were just off topic, but we didn't look into them in a lot of detail now. We should probably. Yeah. Okay, so what we have now is a labeled data set, which we use for exploratory analysis, but the point of using NLP and all of this is really to hopefully be able to scale it all up across a breadth of news articles that is impossible to analyze manually, as has been done so far. And as a step towards this goal, we tested a number of predictive models that can take as input a news article and predict one or more frames for that news article. So it's a multi-label prediction problem where for every news article, we can predict between 0 and 5 frames. And we have a couple more desiderata here. So in this particular setting of looking at media bias, predicting media bias, I would argue that transparency is very important. We don't want to, well, we definitely don't want poor models or biased models, but we also want the users of these models to kind of be able to reason about why a certain prediction has been made. And one side of this coin is that we want to be transparent regarding why a particular frame was predicted. So for every prediction, we probably want to attach a justification for it. And what we do in this work is this justification is sentences or snippets from the news article, which are particularly predictive for the label, as I show highlighted in blue on the left. The other side of the coin is transparency regarding confidence of predicting a particular frame. So it would be nice to not just predict that there's a conflict frame in this article, but the model can say, I am 98% sure that there's a conflict frame in this article versus I'm only 65% sure, in which case we should probably take the prediction with a grain of salt. So I will now present a model that kind of fulfills these desiderata. And how does this work? We take as input a news article and we embed every single sentence into embedding space. And we use off-the-shelf methods called SentenceBird. I'm not sure what the NLP, well, I know that the people I know in the audience know a lot about NLP, but if anyone wants to know more about the methods or the background, just shout out and I can tell more. But there are methods which allow you to just encode a sentence into a vector representation in the way that sentences which are similar in meaning will also be closely grouped together in this vector space. And that's what we do with all of the sentences. So every sentence is mapped to a vector, which is projected into vector space. And then we also map descriptions of our 5 frames into the same space. So economic consequences, human interest, and so forth. We take these as little sentences, embed them with the same method, and map them into the same vector space so that now we can directly compare vector representations of frames with vector representations of all the different sentences in a news article. And then we can measure how relevant or how related every sentence from the news article is to every particular frame. And we measure the relevance of a sentence to a frame just by their cosine similarity in the embedding space. So between the embedding of a sentence and the embedding of a particular frame. And we do this for all of our actually 5 frames. And by doing so, for every frame individually, we can rank the sentences in the news article by relevance. So with respect to every frame, we get a different relevance ranking of sentences in the article. And now this ranking we use as features for a supervised machine learning model that will predict a particular frame from an input news article. And specifically for every frame as these machine learning model features, we take the top 3 most relevant sentences as ranked by this method, plus any other sentences where the cosine similarity exceeds a certain threshold. And then we train 5 independent binary classifiers, 1 for every frame. And the input to these classifiers are, again, embeddings of these sets of sentences that we derived from the embedding vector space, plus the full news article we also give as an input. And given these, again, embedded collections of sentences, the classifier is a simple linear projector, like a logistic regression model pretty much, gives us the probability that this particular frame is present in the news article. So I'm telling you that we are using 5 independent binary classifiers. So we do not strictly do multi-label classification. You could also imagine a model, a single model, which can directly predict any subset of the frames being present, right? But given the fairly small data set that we have, we found that it's pretty different to develop this one model which solves the task directly, and it would be nice to do this because this model could model dependencies between the different frames as well, which we cannot do with this current methodology. But yeah, just as a caveat and maybe an avenue towards future work. So this is our full model, which we call RBF, or retrieval-based frame prediction. We have 2 simpler versions of this model, which we compare against, just to make sure that these 3 features are indeed important. One where we remove the full article from the features. So the features are only these pre-selected collections of sentences. And one where we only look at the top 3 most relevant sentences and also remove the threshold-based additional sentences that we input into the model. So this is kind of the methodology that we propose here. And we also compare this against a couple of baselines, so much simpler methods from the literature. One baseline is just a k-nearest neighbor classifier with TF-IDF features. And the core difference is that this does not have access to any of the neural embedding deep learning mechanisms that underlie the more recent and very powerful NLP technologies. So this is a very simple baseline. And then we use a few of the very common off-the-shelf neural models as a comparison model, and we use BERT and the long former. All of these only have access to the full news article, so not our ranking. And this fine-tuned long former, it's pretty much identical to this model over here, but with only access to the news article, but not the sentence ranking features at all. And then we use a semi-supervised model as well, because if you remember, our original data set was 17,000 climate-related news articles. We labeled only a tiny subset. So one obvious question to ask is whether we could use some of the unlabeled data in addition to the labeled data. So we explored that to some extent using an off-the-shelf semi-supervised version of BERT, but there's certainly more to be done in the future. And here are the results. So I'm just starting with a random baseline where a classifier would just randomly predict whether a frame is present in the article or not. And a majority voting baseline where for each of the 5 frames, the particular classifier predicts the majority label. So if the frame was present in most of the news articles that we have labeled, it would always predict a 1. If it was mostly not present in the news article, it would mostly predict 0. And that's what we get here. And for the measurements per se, higher is better. I will not talk about in more detail what they exactly measure, but the F1 score in the very end gives you a kind of overall assessment of the quality of the classifier. Here are the baselines that I showed you, which all perform a lot better than just the very simple baselines, which is reassuring to see. We can see that the semi-supervised model gives quite a boost compared to all the off-the-shelf models that we first tried. And our RBF model outperforms all other models in terms of recall and also in terms of overall performance, just barely. But bear in mind that the SNPEX, this is the semi-supervised model, has access to all 17,000 news articles, whereas ours here works with only 400-ish labeled ones. So one takeaway from here is that very simple semi-supervised learning does not really give you much. I would hope that in future work we can improve this by using the unlabeled data in a slightly more clever way, but this has not worked here yet. And then if you remember, we had the two impoverished version of our own classifier where we hide some of the features from the model. And we can show that in both of these cases, performance drops compared to the full model, which suggests that the combination of the three types of features we have, they're all meaningful, they all give kind of complementary information to the classifier so that the final performance gets a little bit better. So this is the quantitative evaluation. And I think, right, next, if you remember the desiderata, one of them was that we want a transparent model. So what we can now do is look at certain articles for which a particular frame was predicted. And then because of the embedding space where we looked at the relevance of a certain sentence to a certain frame, we can just pull out the sentences that were particularly relevant to a particular frame. And here I show you one example for the conflict frame for one specific article from The Guardian, where I manually highlighted the most relevant kind of pieces of text. There's talk about foreshadowing a fight, about being aggressive, about pressures and debates and so forth, which all intuitively hint at the presence of conflict in this article. Here's another example for the resolution frame from a BBC article. So there is the frame, a frame about alleviating or resolving the issue here, or kind of concrete suggestions on how to do this, about a certain approach, solutions being implemented in a certain way, and yeah, concrete suggestions on how to improve the issue under discussion in that particular article. Yeah, we can go through all of them. Here's one about economic consequences, which is about jobs, economic growth, revenue, price signals, and so forth. And finally, one for human interest, where human interest is about impact on individuals, and at least the second most relevant frame here, a sentence here, you can see that the article goes into the particular impact of losing a home for a certain person and goes into quite a bit detail on that. Okay. This concludes the main part of the talk. And just to conclude with a couple of thoughts. So I presented to you a kind of framework for tying together narratives and frames by leveraging one of the most highly used frame sets in the communication literature, pulling it into NLP and trying to formalize it in a way that we can reliably annotate data with these frames and with entities that kind of are suggested by these frames. I showed you some analysis of what fell out of this annotation and showed you at least initial results on predicting frames. Now, where do I see this going? There are a couple of conceptual and methodological next steps that I can see. And again, if anyone is interested in this and would like to talk about this, I'm very much open to this. So conceptually, we only modeled the presence or absence of these 5 frames, but we did not model the entities at all. So this would be an interesting thing to consider and also to consider jointly with the frames. So intuitively, if you know that there's an entity in an article who is framed as a hero or in a heroic role, you probably know that there's some talk about resolutions of the conflict and vice versa. If you know that there's talk about resolutions, probably we can pinpoint an entity who's responsible for these resolutions or who could help to get towards these resolutions. It would be nice to scale these analyses, of course, to other topics beyond climate change, and also maybe more interestingly to other languages, and compare the narratives between different languages and cultures, possibly not even other languages. So this is this is half US, half British. Actually, there was a lot of news articles from The Guardian and the BBC, for instance, but just looking at the different narratives between these English-speaking cultures could be one interesting next step as well. And then, as I said earlier, I'm very interested in looking more at the perception or the effects of these. So if we could expose people in the lab to certain narratives, could we measure their effect on the participants' attitudes to a certain complicated issue, probably in a highly controlled and very much simplified scenario, but even there, measuring the impact of narrative framing or the effects of narrative framing is something that I'm very interested in. And then on the methodological end, we could leverage the unlabeled data for semi-supervised prediction. One interesting question that got quite a bit of attention in machine learning and NLP recently is that annotator disagreement is not at all necessarily noise, especially in complicated tasks like this one. When it comes to framing, it's more often than not a function of, well, subjectivity that you can never completely suck out of a task, right? And figuring out ways to model this subjectivity or model the actual uncertainty inside a task rather than just dismissing it and going straight to majority kind of voting is a very interesting area, I think. And in this particular context, with this particular data set, I think there might be interesting questions to ask as well. And then finally, our annotations were all local by highly trained annotators. And I wonder if we can, so the basic assumption was that we simplify a very complex task of labeling 5 frames by breaking it up into 22, hopefully simpler tasks by answering very specific binary questions. I wonder if we can do this even more to an extent that it might be possible to do this annotation even by crowdsourcing, maybe by crowdsourcing. Okay, I'm pretty much done. High quality crowdsourcing, ideally. But yeah, if we can simplify even more to an extent that we can have very concrete instructions and leverage online workers, which would also be much more diverse, which is a nice feature to have as well, compared to the very small sets of annotators that we can hire locally, which will probably all be undergrad, English-speaking, English native-speaking students, probably progressive, well-educated, and so forth. Scaling that up to a broader crowd would be a great thing to do. So that brings me to the end. On the paper, these are my lovely collaborators, a master student, Shima, my PhD student, and Gosha, a colleague. And if you wanted to chat about any of this, feel free to let me know. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Leah. That was super interesting. I'm just curious, have you looked at, so one of the nice things is indeed the transparency and having some confidence. Did you compare the confidence of the model prediction with kind of the confidence of the raters, or did you have enough data to see if there's a kind of reality to the confidence?
We have not, but we should. Yeah, that's a very good suggestion. But yeah, I couldn't say anything more intelligent than this at this point. But yeah, we should probably look at this. Yeah.
All right, we've got a couple of questions online. Kevin, do you want to chime in with yours first?
Hello, nice talk. That was great. Very interesting. I was just wondering, there is a pre-trained T5 on Hugging Face called Frame Semantic Transformer. Did you try that out at all, or?
No. Do you know
Okay.
what fine-tuned on?
So it was fine-tuned on the FrameNet annotation data, FrameNet 17.
Right. So FrameNet is relevant here, but it's a different type of frame than what
I see.
I
Right.
was talking about.
I guess
yeah.
it's more of a macro structure level,
Yeah.
what you're getting at, but I think that you might, because you can get the entire kind of annotation network, the entire network of frames. So you could like embed it within the broader network of frames, but again, yeah, maybe it's not really set in stone whether those are, that it's a gold standard or anything. Okay, great. Yeah, great talk. Thanks.
Thank you. And I think the point of connecting FrameNet frames, so FrameNet is a resource where verbs are associated with certain frames. So a verb takes a certain number of actors, right? An agent, a patient, sometimes there's a second object. And a lot of verbs have different meanings, in which case these participants play different roles in the context of the verb. So FrameNet is a semantic resource where people manually annotated verbs with the different semantic roles that they require in order to form a grammatical sentence, which is related to what I was talking about, the roles of the entities in a news article, but it is a lot more local and tied to the English language and semantics. But yeah, I think bringing the two together, or seeing it where they could overlap and where the FrameNet frames could enhance the questions we are asking here, is a great suggestion. And maybe the transformer could be a first step towards this. So thanks for that.
All right,
Thank you.
Do you want to chime in with yours?
Yeah, really great question, talk, Leah. And mine it's sort of unwieldy, but something that's partially captured by your data about which had split things off into questionable sources, but I guess I'm wondering if less on a source level than an article level, if you or anyone has specifically compared the types of frames used by articles which are disinformation or misinformation compared to more reliable things. I know that would require a separate tagging of such articles, but I know that, some people have done that. And so particularly to see, do articles which are misinformation contain or rely on certain frames? And then I guess the related question was, if no one's done that, or you don't know about that, has anyone taken this and looked at whether some frames, articles associated with some frames spread in different ways? So like faster or, more deeply, or that sort of thing.
Yeah, all great suggestions. So this is going to be published in July. It was just accepted, so no one has taken this, unfortunately, and done more with it. But I hope people will, and I certainly want to do this. So as you say, our questionable source tags, they don't correspond to misinformation necessarily. So questionable sources might also actually distribute real information. But applying the models, perhaps, if we trust them, decide we trust them sufficiently to a data set where this distinction is systematically made, would be an interesting next step. And what you suggest about whether certain narratives are processed quicker or slower, that's, yeah, I think a very big whole next research project where I would need domain expertise for sure to do it properly, but it is something that I'm interested in. And yeah, one way to approach this question of frame perception could be maybe simply reading time without even trying to access downstream switches in attitude or in behavior, but just process the perception of the frames rather than their impact. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
All right. So let's. Oh, we got one more question. Hi.
Again, thanks. Very interesting. Can you say more about how the frame embeddings were computed?
The frame embeddings. So there were kind of two steps. Do you mean this?
Yeah.
We used SentenceBird. That means anything to you. It's an off-the-shelf tool that was just trained to map natural language sentences to vectors with the objective that sentences that we know a priori are very similar, they should also be very similar in embedding space. So it's a transformer-based model, a bit similar to BERT and so forth, but specifically trained to do well at embedding whole sentences with respect to semantic similarity. So SentenceBird is the keyword probably.
But in terms of the frame embeddings, like were they done like based on keywords that apply to the frames or?
Oh, sorry, the right-hand side, yeah.
Yeah.
We used the full the same description that we used in the, no, sorry. We had, after our confirmatory factor analysis, for every frame, we have between 2 and 3 questions that associate with that frame. And we embedded these questions as a representation of the frame.
All right, thank you.
All right, if there aren't any more questions, we might call it there. So thanks, Leah, for speaking, and thanks everyone for coming.